Hello and welcome back to another episode of Into the Hemaverse, your guide for everything going on in the Hemaverse. I am Colin Vredenberg, and here with me, as always, my co-hosts, David Rao.
Back from the dead.
And Nathan Gruperes.
I haven't died once yet.
It is nice to be back, I have to say. It is really nice to be back and talking with you guys again. I missed you. I missed you tremendously. So here we are, back again, doing another episode. This one's on swordcrafting. So we have a special guest here today that will be with us shortly. Jesse Belsky from Jesse Belsky Stage Swords. Jesse Belsky Stage Swords. I'm glad I can pronounce
Jesse.
all of those words, whereas the last time it was garbledy-gook. But first, the news. David, let's start off with your news.
I am doing online private lessons now. So if you are interested in doing private lessons in basically anything, I do it all. So pretty much, side sword, long sword, rapier, pretty much everything, along with if you're interested in more tactical and or tournament footage analysis, fencing analysis, that sort of thing. I'm doing private lessons. So right now you can just message me on Facebook. That's the best way to get in contact with me. But I'm also making a coach page, which will be published shortly. So, David Rao, HEMA instructor kind of thing. So you'll be able to contact me that way as well.
Nice.
But it's not published yet. So
yeah, we'll look forward to it though. We'll send you a lot of pictures from tournaments so you can put them up there. Mostly you on the winners on the winners stairs. All right. So Nathan, did you have any news? I know your club is back and going. So anybody in the Houston area who's looking for lessons, that guy right there.
No news. I mean, we've just been kind of picking back up and slowly, getting more and more people back out and kind of getting some steam back from everything that we lost. Luckily, I will say, I don't know how the rest of the state is doing, but Harris County, where I live, seems to be handling COVID quite well. We've been on a steady decline of cases and hospitalizations and things for 2 months now. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's always it's like a
yeah, I think we're just started trending in the wrong direction.
Oh, my county's always been trending down, but we haven't.
I think Maryland though is going as a state is going back up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Montgomery County has been really strict on lockdown rules, to much the chagrin of literally everyone in the state, but it just seems to be working, so it's hard to argue with results. But in the Hemaverse, we've got some other news and announcements. First up, David and I are extremely excited about this one. Siggy is now making Kriegmesser and Langmesser, and oh boy, do I want one of those.
Yeah,
Oh
they
my
look
God.
awesome.
I love the fact that their Langmesser, they made a long blade, because practically every messer maker is producing messers with short blades, which messers historically had all sorts of different lengths blades. But a lot of the messers you see in the treatise actually have fairly long blades to them. So I'm really excited that you can buy a single-headed messer with a long blade on it.
Yeah.
Also, you can get it with a curve to it, which is cool.
Yeah, actually, so I saw that and I was like, oh man, I just put in that order for the Easton Saber and now I kind of want one of these. It's like, well,
yeah, I'm trying to decide if I should sell swords to buy swords.
That's always the struggle, right? Because is it ever worth it? Sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes it is. Another big set of news came out just a couple of days ago. Pro Gauntlet had a huge info drop on Facebook Their post is massive, but basically it looks like it's getting a ton of really good reviews. I think this is technically their second iteration, like their Mark II version that they sent out to their I think it was Indiegogo or whatever their backers were. But they did specifically say that pre-orders are now looking like they're going to ship sometime. If you're lucky, it will be December of this year, of 2020, but most pre-orders will probably not be filled until April of 2021. So a little bit disappointing, but also, what tournaments are actually going to be going on? Not much that we can really travel through, unfortunately.
They've also been very straightforward and honest about that, which is nice.
Yeah,
they're not like, oh, it's coming out next month. I mean, the next month. Like they've been like, hey, we think it's gonna come out then, but we're not sure. And then they've been, so that's been nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're probably one of the best companies as far as just like making sure that we know what's going on. Also embedded in that post, I pulled the information out to give you the cliff notes. Small and medium sizes are slated for Q3 2021, which is way sooner than I thought it was going to be. But if they're, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's small and large.
I thought it was small and medium.
No, I think the one that's coming out is basically a medium. But I could be wrong.
Okay.
It's more because it's like
I might have read that wrong.
So what they did was they took measurements of like 700 people's hands,
mm-hmm.
and then they produced one that's like based on average proportions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the next one is going to be smaller and then also a larger one, but I could be wrong.
Oh, yeah. The way that I read it was the ones they're producing now are large, and they're going to work on a medium size and then a small size. But you know what? I'm going to go back and read it again, and then I'll just edit it and put it right in here. We'll see who's right. Who's right? Am I right? Is David right?
I know they're also eventually planning on having like a bunch of sizes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they also said that they were going to make an extra large size as well for those really, really big guys. Of which we are none of the above.
No, not us.
Not us. So really quickly, the last couple things, we got to get to Jesse really quick. The Fiore and Talhofer manuscript facsimiles through Hema Bookshelf, a.k.a. Michael Chidester, a.k.a. the Wichtenauer guy, still available. I think it's $175 for one or $350 for both of them. I think that's correct, but it's still running. So if you are interested and you want a beautiful copy of those manuscripts, you're not really going to get another chance after this. So definitely hit that website, hit that subscribe button. Just kidding. And the last thing is our own. Obviously, we are back. Thank goodness. David is healthy and safe and doing well, and
not dead.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. We will be we're still trying to put on that first AMA. Details still coming, but I think we've got something locked down. It's going to be really exciting. So please submit your questions to either intothehemaverse@gmail.com, or you can submit questions for the AMA in the comments to this YouTube video. We'll accept either of those. We're going to compile them over the next about a month, and we're shooting for early November, I think, is what we're shooting for. I love Nathan's smile. It's awesome. Great. So without much further ado, because some of us got to get going, let's get right into our guest segment and welcome on my man, Jesse Belsky. Great. All right, so for our special guest today, we have Jesse Belsky, owner, proprietor, and master craftsman of Jesse Belsky Stage Swords. Jesse, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Hey, so obviously we've wanted to have you on for a while because we have all used your Hema swords, and we love them. But you were not always a HEMA guy. So our usual first question is always, how did you get started in HEMA?
Mm-hmm.
For you, you don't really practice HEMA. So
No.
how did you get started in making swords? Tell us your story.
Sure. I came to sword making by way of stage combat, and I came to stage combat by way of being a kid who loved swords, and so in high school I started doing some. There was like a little bit of like SCA fencing maybe, and some sport fencing at Penn State University where they had like a club for middle school age kids. And I fenced a little bit of saber there for a couple of years.
All right, so you came by it honestly.
Thank you. But I was also, when I got into high school, I fell in with the theater crowd and started doing a lot of mostly technical theater, a little bit of performance, and sort of encountered stage combat, which is the, sort of theatrical version of sword fighting. And I thought that was awesome. And I kept studying that, and I studied that a little bit in high school. And then when I went to college, I studied and eventually certified with the Society of American Fight Directors as an actor combatant. And they do a bunch of different sort of like weapons areas. But
what were your 3 weapons? Because you have to do 3.
I did broadsword, sword and shield, rapier and dagger, and unarmed and knife, I think.
Oh, okay. So you needed just one more to be an advanced actor combatant.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
And then after college, I moved to New York, and I was doing what I do, like the other half of my living is I'm a theatrical lighting designer, and that was what I did in college, and that was what I did in graduate school, and that's what I do now. Except, of course, COVID has closed every theater in America, so now I'm a full-time sword maker. But usually, I'm a half-time sword maker and a half-time lighting designer. But as I was pursuing lighting design, I was also kind of on the side doing fight directing, stage combat choreography, and stuff like that. And I kept doing that after college, and then I went to graduate school at the Yale School of Drama, and that's a 3-year program. And I was initially kind of excited because there's a fairly famous stage combat choreographer, Rick Sordelay, who teaches at Yale. But as it turned out, he taught the same day that the head of the lighting program, Jennifer Tipton, taught, which was Monday, which is in theater the day off. You work the week and then you take Monday off. Mm-hmm. So there was like never going to be a time at Yale where I was going to be able to study stage combat, even if they let me like audit a class with the actors, which wasn't necessarily true, but just was never going to happen. And so after about a year of grad school, I was just sort of like a little bit stir crazy and feeling, sword starved. And I read an article about aluminum stage combat weapons. And the thing about making weapons out of aluminum, if you use the right kind of aluminum, is that you don't need to heat treat aluminum. You get it pre-heat treated, and then you just work it in a way that doesn't wreck the heat treat. And you end up with a very strong usable blade for hitting other aluminum blades with. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had access to the tools that I might need to make a blade or a sword out of aluminum, because it didn't require, forge, it didn't require heat treating oven. It did just a bunch of, the bar was much lower for sort of like moving that material around in a way to make a sword shaped object. Mm-hmm. And so I gave it a shot. And, as a lighting designer, like we didn't spend a lot of time in the shops at Yale. There's a whole technical design and production department that does that. But the folks in the TD&P department were sort of very friendly and like didn't really know what I was about, but I was like, can you show me how to use this lathe, and can you show me how to use this milling machine? And people would give me 30 minutes of their time and give me a guide around that particular tool. And so I sort of like puttered away in my spare time and started making some aluminum bladed swords, and so that was where sword making started.
Cool. Yeah, and a lot of actors I know, and at least nowadays, prefer the aluminum blades because they're so much lighter. Yeah. And just I remember using one when I was doing stage combat. It's like a lightsaber almost. There's no weight to it. So
yeah, you can make a very badly balanced aluminum sword in either direction. Like it can be tough to make a broadsword. In the theater, like the goal is to make the fights look real. You want to look the weapon to look both dangerous and like it has appropriate weight. Sometimes they look like they're too heavy because they are too heavy and people aren't strong enough to wield them appropriately, and they're too heavy because they're built like tanks so that they can be clanged against other swords 8 times a week for 50 years and never break, and that makes for a shit sword.
Mm-hmm.
But if you make that same sword out of aluminum, you can either, recreate a sword that handles like a lightsaber, where the blade sort of has no presence, and that can be good or bad depending on the needs of the sword and the performer. Then you have to act like the sword has weight, and that's a lot easier to act than acting like a sword doesn't have weight when it has too much weight. Yeah. So anyway.
So aluminum blades was your introduction. How did you get into HEMA swords specifically?
So I moved from aluminum blades ultimately to steel blades, and I'm not a bladesmith. I make aluminum blades for film and theater weapons, and I buy steel blades from anyone who makes and sells steel blades for mounting on the hilts that I make. And sometimes that involves a bunch of modifications to those blades, or regrinding and stuff like that. So I don't not touch blades, but I don't make sword blades from scratch. Every now and again, I do like a batch of kitchen knives as wedding gifts and stuff like that, but I don't make sword blades. So I started, I moved from aluminum into steel and used steel blades that were available. And then I was actually, because we obviously talked about what the topics for this discussion were going to be, and I looked back at my email to see when was the first time I had an email that said HEMA in it. And it was 2014, I think, was the first time somebody contacted me about a HEMA specific sword. Because up to then, I had transitioned from just making swords as a hobby and whatever garage space I had available to making stuff for sale, mostly to the stage combat community. So mostly theater, some film, mostly theater folks. And I started doing a lot of rapiers and complex hilts. And so somebody found me and was interested in getting a very elaborate rapier hilt, but with a dark wood HEMA blade. And that was the first time I made somebody a sword that was not going to be for stage performance, but was going to be for HEMA work. And it gradually trickled in thereafter. Every now and again somebody would contact me about something for HEMA. And then when I moved here to DC 3 or so years ago and encountered all of you guys and was local for VIF and the other clubs in the area, then there's just been a lot more interest in business, and I've started making things more specifically for the HEMA community as opposed to just waiting for that stuff to come to me.
Yeah, I think specifically once you moved to this area, was your big kickoff the Mordschlag swords for Bill Grandy, or was there something before that?
I had done a couple things for Bill prior to that, before we started working on that project, and I had visited a bunch of the clubs in the area, and so there had been other bits and pieces. But I think once Bill got to know me, he started talking me around, and then you, Colin, started showing up a lot, and David, and just lots of different people either needed big things or small things, and then once they were familiar with my work,
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I at the time that I started, the first message I ever sent to you was about some rapier hilt, I think. But it was funny because I was getting it on both sides, because David was like, actually, if you want a really good sword, there's this guy, Jesse Belsky, who works he lives in DC and he's local, and he makes some fantastic stuff. And at the same time, I was taking stage combat, and I was getting the same thing from Casey Kaliba, who was saying, he's like, oh man, if I had the money to get a bunch of Jesse Belsky swords, man, I was like, it'd be like an easy one. So at that point, I was just like, okay, I need to see what this guy is about. But yeah,
and now I'll point out that all of the swords on your wall that are visible are swords that I made.
They are, and they're up there for that exact reason. Actually, and we're gonna get to the longsword, because I'm gonna ask you about the longswords that you do, because that's relatively new, right? I don't think you've done a lot of HEMA longswords.
And I still don't. I mean, I think my basic approach to everything is do I have, with the tools, skills, and equipment that either I have or have access to using, can I make something that somebody wants and is useful and comes anywhere near a reasonable price? And particularly for long swords, HEMA long swords, the vast majority of people who want a HEMA long sword are there for, the blade and the handling, and that's key. And I don't make blades, so, and the hilts of most long swords are neither particularly complicated nor like they're going to get worked pretty hard. So like getting a very attractive sword doesn't really help you. So, I don't like, nobody needs to come to me for a basic HEMA fetter, because I'm going to end up charging you more than you would if you just went to the people who I had to buy a blade from to make that same HEMA fetter. And I, like, if you come to me and you say, hey, can you make me this? I'll say, listen, I can make it my way and it'll cost this much. If you don't care about, these aspects of it, you should go over here, because these people will be able to, and like, that's what they do, is they put together HEMA fetters, as their main business. And I don't. But if you want a, like a fancy complex hilt longsword, I just did one of those with a, is it Regenier? How do you, is that, am I saying that right?
Regenier?
Regenier.
I'm not actually sure.
We bought a fetter. I took it apart. They're very well put together. It took a while to take apart, and I modified it so it could take a big sort of complex hilted longsword guard, and I redid it for that purpose. And I recently made it somebody else a fetter that had like bears and gold etched into the hilt and pommel. So like, if you have specific needs, which either the people who make fetters aren't doing or aren't doing in kind of the time scale you want, then I can help you with a longsword fetter. But if you just need a basic longsword fetter, then I'm not the person for you.
Yeah, you're definitely, I would say you're definitely in that in the realm of like custom, like fancy customs. You're like you're more, except I will say your side swords are a little bit different, but mostly what you do is like Mercedes level, I would say.
Thank you. Well, I tried. That is what I'm aiming for, is sort of like a high level of aesthetic and sort of historical accuracy in terms of the design and aesthetics. And if that's being applied to a stage combat sword, I'll build it in one way. And if it's being applied to a HEMA sword, I'll build it a little bit differently, so it's a little bit more durable and able to take more punishment. And then side swords are the place where, there seems to be some space where I can use a relatively inexpensive blade, which I have access to, modify that, put together a hilt that's relatively inexpensive and sort of simple for me to produce, and then offer that at a reasonable price, where it's competitive with other people in the marketplace. So that's sort of like the one kind of economy-ish sword version, and it's still, it's heavily customizable and can be made more detailed. But
and I believe at the time that you started offering that was basically when I jumped in. And what I found was even the people who were making, daily driver kind of swords, they weren't good. Like the side swords on the market were just like, they were so heavy and like awkwardly weighted. Like, I'm trying to think of some examples, but they were just not enjoyable. And I actually, my first sword and buckler sword was a garbage tier arming sword that was just way too short and way too heavy and way too stiff. And then I held one of your side swords and I'm like, all right, I don't care what you want for this, I'm buying it. Like,
yeah, I mean,
it's good. I know, I mounted up a bunch of stuff for David too. For side swords, I'm mostly using, I mount whatever people want, Darkwood, Castile, etc. But the Hanwei 43-inch practice ray pure blade, when substantially modified down to like 32 inches, makes for a very nice, durable, not at all floppy side sword training blade, and they cost wholesale like $50 a pop. So that's a very affordable blade that I can put some time into and produce a good blade for HEMA that you guys seem to enjoy. And then there's been a learning curve. Like the first hilt I sold David, David had on for a little while, and it came back and the guard arms were like bent down like that, because that was a hilt I had made for stage combat. And so, like starting, as I often do, from 1/4-inch plate stock that gets laser cut, like the arms of that guard were fully sort of diamond beveled, so the cross section was less substantial. And if you're going to take side sword cuts on your guard a lot in a HEMA context, you just need more steel than that. And so I took that guard back and replaced it with another one that sort of was my in between, and now I have a couple of them sitting on my desk here right now. But it's just like it's not substantially heavier, because it's obviously not a very big guard, but it's like beefier in the right places to resist, to be able to take that kind of abuse. And that's been a learning process for me too, is sort of like what, obviously HEMA folks can break anything, but like what are the adjustments
We will.
from my background in stage combat to make weapons for HEMA use that are going to be durable enough to serve appropriately.
Yeah, the after the first one, once I had the second one, I think I've fenced in like 4 or 5 tournaments with that, and so it's gotten a ton of abuse and it's held incredibly well.
Good, I'm glad to hear it.
And like I've had people be like, "Ooh, Hanwei, like it's a Hanwei blade," and I'm like, "No, it's fantastic." Like one, when it's cut down, it significantly changes the handling, and and then people are like, "Yeah, but don't do these break all the time?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, sometimes you get like a bad blade, but I actually bought, like, because they're cheap, I bought like 5 blades." So I was like, I will have all these backup blades for when the blade breaks, and I can just swap it out, and it hasn't broken.
There you go.
I had that exact same experience where the first tournament that I used a side sword in, the blade broke, and then the next thing I did was, Jesse, I need 2 more blades. So I always have a backup, and now it hasn't broken since then. So
it's voodoo magic or whatever. But like, listen, when somebody makes a blade that never breaks, like, you should buy it. Like, everyone should buy one of those. I'll buy them and I'll mount them. Like, but everyone's blades break. All blades break eventually. Like if you use them hard, any piece of metal will fatigue and break. And some will break sooner than others. And this is not the aerospace industry. So like the level of quality control testing, even like for the people who are doing the very best in this community in terms of, computer controlled heat treatment and stuff like that, like nobody's getting their stuff X-ray inspected afterwards to make sure there are, no microfractures or inclusions. Like, it just, like, the market can't sustain that kind of investment in quality control, and the prices don't warrant it. So even if you've spent $285 for a blade from, one of the higher end makers, like they have warranty. So if it breaks right away and there was a flaw, they'll replace it. But if it breaks eventually, like, it's gonna break eventually. Everything breaks eventually.
Yeah, so. Actually, we've talked about that before, where we're just like, man, I don't want an unbreakable fetter, because that's going to be the stiffest, like, most bleh blade.
Well, like, to go back, you were talking about your first arming sword. Like, part of the reason why it handled so terribly is because the edge is like super thick, because the maker was like, I want to make this hold up against anything, right? But then that just makes the weapon just not handle like a sword should.
Yeah, exactly. And
another thing is, I love, like, so many makers, like, if you break the sword, you have to buy a whole new sword. Like, you can't just buy a new blade, because you can't just unscrew the pommel and swap it out. So I love having that ability to do that. And
sorry, go ahead.
I think I have you modify, or I was gonna have you modify one of my long swords so I could do that. I haven't done it yet. But.
I think there's like a trade-off between indurability for like a compression fit sword, and the compression fit sword is like any sword where either the pommel screws on or there's a pommel nut, but where like some sort of screw mechanism is holding the thing together. And I would agree with people who say like that does put the tang under a different kind of stress than if you have sort of like you have a guard that's, either shimmed or peened solidly in place, and then a pommel that's peened solidly in place, and then a grip goes on top of that. There's trade-offs, right? Because like then if the blade breaks, you have a bunch of parts that you either can't take off and replace the blade, or take a lot of time and energy to take off and replace the blade. And so, obviously different people come down on different sides of that. As a person who doesn't make blades, I'm in favor of having less expensive, more replaceable blades, as opposed to more expensive, unreplaceable blades.
Right.
But I think people can disagree on that.
Another thing is, I think there's kind of a widespread kind of idea in the HEMA community that if a blade breaks like in the tang, you have to just throw it away. And I know I've had you've repaired a couple of my swords where the tang is broken, and you just welded a new tang on there, and then it's actually been more durable than it was previously.
There's like a lot of hoodoo out there about tangs and welding and everything, and like everything else, like if you do something correctly and appropriately for the kind of steel it is, you know, you can make repairs. There are plenty of tangs that have bad welds and break, and I've done bad welds that have broken. But if you weld an appropriate kind of steel with an appropriate kind of welder to a different kind of steel, also appropriate, and then you either, you don't really have to anneal that steel, but you have to make sure that it didn't harden when it cooled. So you have to like kill the temper in that area. You end up with something that's going to be pretty strong. And certainly if you've lost just the very end of your tang, you know, the worst that can happen is that the tang can break again, but it probably won't break in the same place where it got welded. It'll probably break somewhere else because the weakness is more likely to be in the original steel and the original heat treat than in the welded section. But in general, any tang that you're dealing with shouldn't be the same temper as the blade, because it just doesn't want to be, because it's not doing the same thing. Like you want a tang to have more bend, and then you would. Well, that's more true for a sharp blade. Hema blades are obviously pretty flexible to begin with, so I don't know.
I'd just like to say that you need to be able to unscrew the pommel to end him rightly. So it's kind of a requirement.
I mean, unless it breaks off, and that's your only option. So
unscrew it and throw it.
I've had that happen accidentally, where the tang broke at the pommel, and I went to cut, and the sword just launched out of the. And I'm holding the handle, the pommel, it cracked. The tang broke, but the pommel was still like glued to the handle. So I'm holding a guard, and my sword just flew out of my hands. I'm like, what just happened?
Yeah, which is like a much less problematic scenario in HEMA than it is
in stage
combat.
Yeah.
And like I once saw a chunk of a Starfire blade fly into a full audience at the Utah Shakespeare Festival when I was, a long time ago, when I was an electrician there, when I was in college. But one of the reasons stage combat weapons are also overbuilt is because like a critical failure in a performance scenario can not just be like very embarrassing for your play, but it can be like legitimately dangerous to the large crowd of closely packed people who are very close to you. In HEMA, like, not that there aren't often people standing around, but you're a little, I think, less likely to, launch your sword component into a crowd.
True, but there has been a couple times I've seen at tournaments where like a blade broke, and you have like the end of the blade like with a jagged cut, and it flies towards the crowd, and I'm like.
Yeah, totally.
Luckily, nothing has ever happened.
Or a cutting tournament where the sword flies out of the guy's hand.
Plexiglass shields. I mean, I'm a safety guy, so the sword's gonna break, and you don't know when. So
another thing is, I mean, HEMA people have kind of this idea that the hilt furniture for the sword has to be like indestructible as well. But historically, I think like guards just weren't hardened, right?
I mean, guards were iron. It's not even that they weren't hardened. They were they were iron, and iron is much softer than steel. But people were using those swords very, very differently than HEMA practitioners were using. So, I think there's you're doing something very different with your tool than that person was doing with their tool. And so it has to meet different requirements. Like you wouldn't want a HEMA sword with a hilt made out of iron because it would just smoosh. You'd be held by those blades. I make all of my stuff out of mild steel because I know how to work with mild steel and weld mild steel, and I don't do heat treating. There are people out there who heat treat sword hilts, and they are stronger than my sword hilts for like the same dimensionality of the hilt components. So you can make a lighter, thinner sword that has the same strength out of heat treated steel. That's not something that I have the capacity to do, and for that reason I alter the dimensions of things to make them what I believe to be appropriately durable. So that's also
now, doesn't it also, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't it also, when you heat treat a guard, doesn't it make it more brittle and more prone to breaking?
It shouldn't. Like if you harden something, it becomes more brittle. But if you temper it, just like a sword blade, like it should be more flexible with greater strength than if it were in an annealed state when it were softer,
Mhm.
and much stronger than if it were in a fully hardened state where it would be very brittle. So I think it's probably pretty difficult to heat treat particularly complex guards in a uniform way, because all of the parts have like different widths and thicknesses, and they're gonna, like, when they're quenched, different things are gonna happen. So like if one were sort of taking like the aerospace engineering perspective of like, how do I get a complex rapier guard where all of the parts and all the joints are going to be whatever, like maximally strong? There's probably a solution to that, although I don't know that it's in the capabilities of everybody who heat treats sword furniture, but I also haven't tested them, so I don't know. I think there is the risk that, again, like, do you want your thing to bend or do you want it to break? And those are your two options. Like, it's either going to give or it's going to bend, or it's going to give and something is going to snap. And so how far you have to push your sword before that happens, and then like whether you want it to bend or break, you get to choose. But if I were capable of doing heat treated sword hilts, I probably would from time to time. Certainly, I think like particularly with thinner sheet stock stuff, like I've done some Scottish basket hilt HEMA hilts, and I think there's definitely a place. Like Chris Adams at Balefire is doing some cool Scottish basket hilted HEMA swords, and he's able to use a much thinner gauge of steel than what I use because he's heat treating it. And so, like he can make a stronger guard out of lesser weight steel than I can, for the same shaped hilt.
Actually, I'm glad that you brought up basket hilts because I have it listed as a bullet point. You make a lot of basket hilts, actually, and they are actually extremely popular. From what I have seen online, and you obviously have better statistics than I do. Your number one sellers are basket hilts, small swords, is what I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of small swords go, and of course there's the new Shyvana that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But
I started doing like mostly sort of rapiers and then basic medieval stuff. And I honestly, like, I have no idea what my sales statistics are. I guess I should consult with my CFO, who, as previously discussed, is the dog, about like where those business lines intersect. But I started doing rapiers because I like rapiers. And then at some point I got the bug to try a Scottish basket hilted sword, and that wasn't frankly very long ago. That was like a year and a half ago maybe that I first decided to make one. But there are just not a lot of people in the market making Scottish basket hilts. There aren't nobody. There are several very talented people making basket hilts, but they have very long wait lists. And so when I started making basket hilts, there were, I think, collectors out there who were like, oh, another person who makes basket hilts who I can buy a basket hilt from, this year, or this, in 2 or 3 months. And that was, I think exciting for those collectors. So I sort of fell down the rabbit hole of Scottish basket hilts, and then recently got approached by 2 different people actually to do Schiavonas. And so I then was lucky enough because Bill Grandy had shown me his antique Schiavona at one point. He was willing to loan that to me so I could make a pattern from it, which was fantastic and a really cool experience, because usually when I make swords based on antiques, I'm making swords based on antiques from pictures, which is a challenging and interesting process, and you rarely know like how close to the mark you have gotten. But in this case, the sword is literally over here, and one of the replicas I made of it is over here, and so I can really closely compare those things.
Speaking of, though,
go ahead.
I just have to point out that I didn't realize that Bill had, that you had his Schiavona and were using it, and I messaged him. I was like, Bill, I want to get Jesse to make me a Schiavona, like based on your Schiavona. And then literally like the next day you on Facebook, you posted it, and I was like, no,
my
idea has been stolen.
And that's also, I think there's like Schiavonas don't appeal to anybody, but there is a group of collectors who are excited about Schiavonas. And again, like there are only so many people who make them. So that was sort of like another, in business terms, like it was like a market space where there was room for me to find, folks. Like the rapier world is, fairly crowded. There are a lot of people making rapiers, and not nearly as many making sort of the other complex basket hilted swords. So,
Yeah, I'd say there's very few that are making. I mean, I know that a few makers will do small swords too, where it's like, here's our economy small sword. It's like something that you can, put and use, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you kind of are, again, that kind of Mercedes level of like, do you want it to actually look like a French court sword? Because here you go, I can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was another place where the sort of stage combat world and the HEMA world were like direct, like it was basically the same object. Like I didn't have to make any modifications. It was the small swords I had been making for stage combat folks. And instead of putting a 35-inch epee blade that had been cut down to 30 inches and was nice and stiff, you just put a number 2 epee on it. And it's exactly what people want in it, by and large, unless you're David again. Doesn't need to be substantially stronger than a stage combat small sword hilt, because what you're not usually doing is having other people charge into you while holding it. And
yeah, I'm going to blame that on my student Anson.
Fair. Okay.
Actually, I would say that David and Nathan both actually have this very particular, I don't know what it is, but they get people mad at them at tournaments specifically. Like Nathan is tricky. Nathan is really tricky. David has like impenetrable defense where it just like frustrates the heck out of people and they just start charging him.
Right,
and Nathan will like dance around people and like laugh and almost like in a jovial, like, haha, you can't get me, sucker. I'm looking at Nathan laughing. But they both, it's just like, and then all of a sudden people get mad and start swinging hard.
It's amazing. It's amazing. People don't fence as well when they're not focused. So make them not focused, and then they won't fence as well.
It's almost as like there's a mental aspect to this game, like
crazy.
Crazy.
My main strategy, as you know, is just to stab them in the foot, because they never expect it, and then they're like, "How did you do that?" And then I do it again, and then they get really mad.
The old troll stab in the foot. So you talked a little bit about it before, but I wanted to kind of expand on this, specifically your process for copying antiques, because like you said, you usually do it by pictures. Like, do you like look up the historical whatever? Do you kind of like peruse auction houses and pick up pictures and then try to do and copy? How does that work?
All of the above. I see stuff on Facebook. I see stuff on Pinterest. I see stuff on auction sites. Auction sites are great because they typically have a lot of pictures. Like they'll often show something in a bunch of different angles and have some number of measurements, even if they're like not all the useful measurements. Some museum sites have those same sorts of pictures, although more often museum sites will have like one single picture of an object without the kinds of usable dimensions you need. So, there are swords that I have collected pictures of where I'm like, this is an amazing sword. I wish I had more pictures and dimensions. And then, sometimes you hit the jackpot and you have kind of like all of the images you need to sort of piece together an idea of what that sword is really shaped like. So if I'm doing it from photographs, I do it in one fashion. And if I'm doing it from an actual piece in front of me, I'm doing it a different way. And I've been lucky enough, to both, Bill's Schiavone here, which I've copied. I have another, I have a main gauche upstairs that is an antique piece that somebody sent me for copying into a HEMA version. So those are two antiques that are living in my house right now, which is really cool. Last year, I guess it was, or the year before last, I had the opportunity to spend some time with a private collection of Scottish basket hilted swords in Baltimore with a private collector. And that was just amazing. Like that was like 5 museum visits worth of basket hilts in fantastic shape. And I could just handle any of them. And I weighed and measured and took notes and all kinds of stuff. So I have a lot of documentation from those weapons, that collection of weapons. And that I did right as I was starting to build Scottish basket hilted broadswords. And that just kind of like gave me leaps and bounds above where I would be had I not had the opportunity to handle kind of And what was key was that it was like a big collection. So, if you're just looking at like one example of a thing, you kind of can get fixated on like what are the specifics of this thing. Whereas if you handle 10, 15, 20 swords of a type, then you start to get an idea of like what is the scope of the way that people were making these. And obviously, like at least in terms of Scottish basket hilted broadsword, that's huge. It's like some blades are super thin and flexible and like just feel like a magnificent dueling sword, and some are long and heavy as shit, and like even if they were cavalry swords, they must have been shit cavalry swords. Like, I don't know, but like, you're just looking at the work product of a bunch of different people working on a theme in different ways and for different purposes. And so like, that was hugely educational.
So from there, I mean, do you take like the like general and then try to make, because I think a lot of times you kind of do your own thing where sometimes you will just like, I'm just going to copy this antique.
Yeah.
But there are other times when you're just like, I kind of like some from this and some from this, and I'm going to kind of do that.
Yeah. It depends on the kind of like Scottish basket hilted broadswords. I have yet to do that because there are so many like terrific and interestingly unique examples.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to like all of my Scottish basket hilted swords are based on one particular piece. And sometimes like I'm not putting the blade on that matches the blade that was on the antique because my access to blades are like, I'm not always ordering a custom blade. I'm sometimes matching a blade from, like a commercial piece with a hilt that I'm making. So that stuff can get mix and match, but like the hilt itself tends to be like, this is what the thing was. And maybe the grip is covered in a different material or a different color of thing, but the design elements of the basket, I'm taking whole cloth. The Belsky Vona, I made 3 or 4 now sort of exact recreations to the extent of my abilities, where I'm sort of taking all of the details from that piece, copying them and making it. And then I recently made another Skivona with a sort of a different design elements, and I used the dimensions from the parts that I had created for Bill's piece so that I would have like a sense of scale and like how far and how long each individual bar needed to be so that I could be sure it would get where it would needed to go. Where it like, but in the middle, I could change the way the things were, like the shape of bits, and do different things because I sort of knew what the shape of the envelope was. And that's very true, certainly in terms of rapiers. Like with rapiers, I often mix and match, the way some bars are shaped on this one, but instead of it being a 2-ring, it's a 3-ring, or it's a loop instead of a this or that. But sometimes, I'll see something and I'll be like, I want to try and do that. I want to try and do that thing. I have sitting over here. It doesn't yet have a blade, but like this was a piece that was.
Oh yeah, I like that.
It may have been at auction a couple times, but it's basically like a 2-ring side sword hilt cross on the back, and it's it's chain carved. And the original is gilded in gold, and like every individual chain link has like a border on it, which I declined to do because sometimes I just can't. But I saw this sword and I was like, fuck, how would you make that? And I've like looked at chain hilts before and always just been like, no. And this one was sort of like,
it called to you.
It did. Well, it was large enough and slightly simplified from some Renaissance chain hilts in a way that I was like, yeah, I might be able to do that. And then, but like still looking at other chain hilts, I'd be like, no, cannot do that. So, some days I just get the bug to like try my hand at making something very specific. And then other times sometimes usually when I'm creating a new design, I will base it on something specific, but then having the drawings for that, I can then mix and match, other pieces with that and create something kind of new and unique from my library of components.
And then every once in a while you'll get a weirdo like me who needs a Tybalt sword to match my exact body specifications. Has to be as long as my actual foot. That's literally, he says in the cross needs to be as long as your own personal foot, and the blade has to be the exact length to come up to your navel. And I was like, all right, I'm taking measurements and sending them to Jesse. you poor man.
Maybe
the stuff I do is fully custom. People come to me, they say, can you make me this thing? And I say yes or no, and then I make them that thing. And the other half is just stuff that I make because I am interested or want to, or you know, and so I sort of like fill the time between commissions with producing stuff that is in stock. For all the people viewing, if you haven't been to my website, please go. I have lots of stuff in stock. If you're not interested in waiting for a custom commission, you can buy right off the website. If it says it's in stock, it's sitting here waiting to go.
He does have some great stuff, and sharps as well. You do sharp longswords and sharp rapiers, I believe, too.
Mm-hmm. Basket hilts, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'm doing some sharp rapiers now. There's a different Hanwei blade that's hollow ground. It's a shortish blade. It's like 37 inches, and I can sharpen that. I can turn that into like a nice sharpened rapier blade that's fairly slender. Larger sharp rapier blades I have to custom order from folks, and so the weights on those tend to be fairly long. You know, from Balefire or Arms and Armor or Darkwood, but I don't have. Those are more challenging to get than, you know, some kinds of medieval sharps or the sharps that I tend to mount on basket hilts and stuff like that. So.
Mm-hmm. The other things that I wanted to mention are your things that not necessarily sword making, right? But one thing to mention, you definitely also do repairs, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much you want to advertise that, and we may need to cut this section out.
No, it's fine. I'm happy to do stuff for folks. I also have, you know, like people send me commercial stuff sometimes to modify, and you know, I will charge whatever I feel like is, you know, worth my time if I have the time for that. So repairs are great, particularly for those folks in the sort of the DC Baltimore metro area, because you can bring it to me and I can fix it and you can pick it up again and no one has to spend, you know, $40 each way for shipping.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, that makes a repair a repair that costs $50 like pretty affordable, as opposed to, you know, being 150 in with the shipping, just to sort of fix something small. And, you know, there's stuff where somebody says, hey, could you do this? And I'll say, I don't really want to, but, you know, always feel free to reach out and ask me.
And the last thing that I wanted to mention, again, we might need to cut this out later. You also do leatherwork too, so you do scabbards and frogs,
Yeah.
And belts too, I believe. So
Yeah.
you can do the whole 9 yards, and you have a couple up on your website, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've done various sort of rapier hanger setups, and then maybe 2 years ago I started sort of 3D modeling and having the sort of hardware for those 3D printed in bronze infused stainless steel, which just meant I could make sort of like more period accurate hardware setups than are mostly available. There are a couple people, you know, like Todd Stuff makes a cast set, and there are a couple other people who do casting sets, but are fairly expensive, and they're sort of like whatever that design is. And so this gave me the opportunity to do like a bunch of different hardware designs. And, you know, like a rapier hanger has like 8 or 12 parts depending on how many buckles it is, and they're like all custom metal bits that either have to be fabricated in steel or cast. And so this was a way that I could produce some like pretty unique and historically accurate hardware, and it's still like 3D printing in bronze infused stainless steel is expensive, and so like those rapier hangers, which I think are, you know, some of the sort of most period accurate on the market in terms of their construction and design, they're pretty expensive. You know, that's like a $600+ rapier hanger. But I, you know, I think they're pretty cool.
right, and so that was the but that was coming, was you make these fantastic rapier hangers, but they are fantastic and they are beautiful, but yeah, they cost about as much as the sword does.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Cool.
In terms of like a sort of a Renaissance perspective on that, right? Like the scabbard, the hanger, like that was all as much part of the presentation of the weapon as the weapon itself was, you know? So like if you want to cheap out on that big chunk of leather that's hanging on your side, you know, you can do that, but like you're undermining your image as a man.
Not just undermining your image as a man. If you go to draw that sword and it doesn't come out right, and because it's not hanging at the right level.
So true. So your life is in jeopardy. So
yeah.
All I can say is, you know, if you're working with a subpar rapier hanger, you do so at your own risk. And I didn't just mean, you know, obviously, you know, women these days also rapier hangers, but historically speaking,
everyone. Especially if you are a of the nobility.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
We're talking-
my rapier hangers are like, some of them are tooled leather, some of them are leather, and there's like obviously like that rabbit hole goes way deeper in terms of crazy embroidery and jeweling and stuff like that, which I don't do. So, I'm just dabbling on the surface of the depths of Renaissance men's extravagance.
Just get some of those like stick-on rhinestones, man.
Just bedazzle it. Yeah.
bedazzle it.
So that's custom. I'm not. If somebody wants a bedazzled rapier hanger,
Since we're speaking of scabbards, I just have to bring this up. Palladini, who's a rapier master, actually the translation just came out fairly recently, has this section at the end of his treatise where he just has these weird, like random situations. And one of them he talks about is you're seated at a table and the guy across from you basically starts talking shit. And you're like, you're going to have to fight. So he tells you to draw your sword partially and then press the scabbard against the ground so that against a wooden core so that it breaks. So then, so it like basically breaks off so that you can then more easily draw the sword. So you can then slide the scabbard further down and draw the sword while you're still seated at the table.
It's wisdom based on some very specific life experience.
Exactly. But he's got several things that are just like, where?
Hold on.
Figure this out.
We have to take a second for this. Did you say you break it, and then you can draw?
So, right, because if your sword's in the scabbard, right, and you're sitting at the table, you have to be able to draw, like, you might not be able to get it out without like standing up, right? So if you draw out, like, let's say 3/4 of the way or halfway, and then break it, you've just, so it bends down. Now you can just throw the rest of it off, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And now I get it. And now I'm like, it's actually kind of brilliant.
Yeah, when I first read it, I was like, what is he talking about? And then I thought, I was like, oh.
This is like some like top tier.
Blades. Now, in addition to ordering backup blades, you should also be ordering backup scabbards.
Scabbards, right?
Only if we're doing real HEMA.
Oh boy! All right, so I think that's all that I had. Guys, did you have any more questions for Jesse?
Yeah, I had one question. There's a lot of, every now and then, I mean, the HEMA community blows up with random things to argue about, but every now and then, people throw fits and say, oh, well, the swords that people are ordering, they're not weighted historically, or they're too long, or the handles are way bigger than they would be historically, and so on and so forth. In your experience, when people are asking for swords from you, how often do they vary, or how much do they vary from like actual historical dimensions and balance points and things like that?
I think the answer to that question is that the scope of swords is enormous, right?
Right.
So there is no, there's no datum point. Like, if somebody wants a rapier that handles like whatever, like there was probably a rapier that handled like that. So I tend to for HEMA customers, I let them dictate like what they want that sword to feel like. As a non-HEMA fencer, my sword handling background is in stage combat. And so people want a stage combat sword to handle very differently than they want a HEMA sword to handle. So that's, as coming to the HEMA world, that's been one of the, the learning curves for me is like, how is it different? How do people want this sword to feel and balance and work? It's different than the way that, I would if I were doing stage combat with it. But what's sort of become clear is that that's not an answerable question, because any two HEMA practitioners will want a different handling out of a sword with exactly the same sort of outside dimensions. And that's fine. That's, I think, the way swords were made originally. They were made for the person who wielded them, and that person had preferences based on how they wanted to wield the sword. So I kind of try not to get hung up on if somebody wants a 45-inch rapier blade with a point of balance of 7 or a point of balance of 2, you choose. And that's, a better choice for somebody who's experienced and knows things about swords than kind of a beginner HEMA practitioner who is kind of crowdsourcing numbers off the internet and making them up. I'm sure there are lots of ways to end up with a sword it doesn't do the things you want it to do. But as a non-HEMA practitioner, like I try not to police that. Like I let people tell me what they need, and otherwise I'm producing things, you know, based on feedback I get. You know, you guys, especially the VAF folks and other folks in the DC community who've come to workshop and who I've sold to or I meet at events, you know, those people pick things up, and like certainly if they're picking them up like at a table at an event, like people always have things to say. And sometimes it's like, this feels amazing. And then the next person comes by and like, this is too tip heavy. And then the next person comes by and says, you know, this is too pommel heavy. And it's like, but like, that's all relatively useful feedback for me. Cause occasionally like everyone will come in one direction, and it'll be, you know, what this side sword really needs is to be a little more responsive in the blade. And like, okay, here's, you know, 3 different pommels, try them out. Like which one of these pommels, so this is a little heavier, this one's a little longer, so it moves the point of balance back a hair, you know, and you sort of get to dial in the user experience that you want in a way that if you're only operating sort of via the internet, like you just can't do. And, you know, so having a local sword maker is undoubtedly, you know, the best way to go if you can get a local sword maker.
Well, what I was going to say is your kind of process where you don't make the blades and you make the hilt furniture was also very common historically. Like blades were often produced, like mass produced, and then shipped, you know, sent all over Europe, right? And then you go to and you can say, okay, let me handle this blade. Okay, I like this blade. Now I want this handle and this. So I think people have this idea that every sword was made by like a smith who's crafting the blade, and then all of the like everything, because that's what movies tell us, but that's really not historical.
Certainly by the Renaissance period, that wasn't almost probably ever true, and even in the medieval period, often wasn't true. But you know, so and that's one of the reasons, like why I don't just buy one kind of blade either. You know, like I use a lot of those HEMA blades. I have a good relationship with Castile. I buy their blades. I buy Darkwood blades. You know, so I'll mount whatever the customer wants, and usually HEMA customers have an opinion. You know, one of the great things about HEMA stuff is like most people aren't doing it by themselves. It's happening in clubs where people are gathering and people are bringing their own equipment, which means any given HEMA practitioner has not just had access to like the one thing that they bought, they have access to hopefully, you know, 10 or 15 or 20 other swords that other people have bought from different places. And so at that point you sort of start to get a feel for, I really like the way the Darkwood baited rapier blade handles. I really like the way that Castile Elite rapier blade handles. You know, just this week, I placed an order with, I'm going to butcher this. It's Milos Martialis Ferenzi.
Malleus Martialis.
Martialis. Yeah, sorry guys. I placed an order with them for 3 side sword blades. They have a thin one and a thick one, and they just made a new one that's like an early side sword blade. And I was like, those look like cool blades. I'll reach out and see if, you know, they want to make blades that I can mount. And they were like, yeah, we'd love to. So that's a new blade manufacturer that hopefully I'll have a relationship with and the opportunity to mount their stuff. So like as a cutler, you know, I have like a stack of blades in the corner from all different places, you know, and like if you contact me for custom work, I can tell you like, here's what I have in stock right now. If you want to order this, we can get it in, you know, this many months. If you want to order that, we can get it in this many months, you know. So that's, you know, a benefit of sort of my angle bringing to the table is that I can, you know, provide you the hilt you desire on the blade you desire. And that goes for stuff that's on my website in stock too. Oftentimes those, if you see a hilt you really like and you're interested in having it remounted with a different blade you prefer, let me know and we can talk about it.
Cool. I just have to point out something for people who, you know, haven't worked with you, is that in the HEMA community, in terms of weapons makers, there's a certain level of, or maybe lack of professionalism and kind of business sense. And working with you you were by far the most professional and prompt, you know, sword maker I've ever had the pleasure to work with, which has been fantastic because, you know, you'll buy a sword and then a year later you get it. Right? And you keep emailing the person, emailing them, what's the status? And there's no response. So working with you has been fantastic.
Thank you. I do my very best to be either sort of accurate or pessimistic about delivery dates. Like if I tell you you'll have it in 2 months, you'll either have it in 2 months or you'll have it in 1 month. Like it won't be more than 2 unless something goes terribly wrong. And then you'll hear from me right away that, the blade that we ordered that said it would be here in 3 months is not going to, it's going to be 5 months. Or, like I tried to do it this way and it completely failed and now I've got to do it again, but if you email me and you don't hear back in 2 days, like send it again because it didn't get to me. And that's like my work queue is not tremendously long. Like I'm not tremendously busy. I can see how other makers can get deluged in communications and lose track, but at the moment, that's not my business model. So I do my best to give realistic estimates and stick to them.
We'll work on getting you more busy then.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
We're going to make you so busy you're going to lose business from not answering emails, Jesse.
Catch-22. I mean, it is a genuine catch-22 for, I think, a lot of small business people, which is, like, there's a point at which, like, you need more business, and there's a point at which you have too much business.
Yeah.
Which like, you can't afford to hire staff to make more stuff, but, like, you also can't keep up. So, like,
yeah,
there are a lot of sword makers who have, been trapped in that kind of problematic spiral. And I feel for them because, like, I know what it is to be waiting for things that, we're supposed to show up and don't show up, to be, spending tremendous amounts of time, like, discussing custom commissions with customers who then, like, at the very end of that discussion are like, well, let me get back to you in 12 months. So there are a lot of ways to lose time and energy in the custom sword making business, but you get to make swords. So
What's that people always say? Living the dream.
Living the dream.
Living the dream.
Yeah.
Well,
And
Jesse, we're right at an hour.
Okay.
So I think it's time to say goodbye. But before that, obviously, please tell us, and I will put it up on the screen, where we can find you out in the Hemaverse.
If you Google Jesse Belsky Stage Swords is all one word, Google will find me. I'm on Facebook. I post regular process shots of, like, stuff I'm working on in the workshop, which some people enjoy keeping track of. And I have an Instagram feed, Jesse Belsky Stage Swords, which is similar. And then my website has both all manner of in-stock products and then also previously sold stuff, so you can sort of, like, see what's gone before and what I'm capable of if you're interested in commissioning something new, or you see something where you're like, oh, that was amazing, I would love to have one of those. That's all on my website. Cool.
Well, again, thank you for coming on the program. It was an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And if you want me back, you know where I live.
Yeah. We'll just knock on your door one day and walk in, no masks. No, I'm just kidding.
If you're in the Washington D.C. area though, and you see something where you're, like, interested in trying it out, pre-pandemic, of course, you're always welcome to come over and handle stuff. I have a backyard, so you can take stuff out, sling it around, and in pandemic times that remains true. You can't come inside, but I'm happy to, like, social distance with you in the yard, bring stuff out, and you can handle it and check it out and see if you're interested.
Very cool. All right. Well, that does it for this episode. Thanks, guys, and thanks everybody out there in the Hemaverse. We'll see you next week.
So long.